now comes my favorite part of this evening, and also in some ways one of my favorite parts of the whole year of projects and programs that we run here at the Dart Center. The chance to sit down with master reporters who have taken us into places that probably none of us as news consumers ever especially wanted to go and yet needed to go, is at the heart of the craft of reporting on trauma. And this is a reporter-to-reporter conversation. For the last 23 years, these conversations have propelled forward, I think, innovation and new ways of reporting. And the strength of this year's winners build on the work that other DART Award winners have done. And journalism in the future will build on what you guys have done. This Winners Roundtable is telling hard stories behind the 2017 DART Award winners. We've got two members from the two DART Award winning teams here. We have Allison and Samantha Broun from Transom, Erin, Alberty, and Rachel Piper from the Salt Lake Tribune. The purpose of this roundtable is to showcase the winning work, explore what's involved in undertaking stories, whether about personal or institutional trauma, the ethical and craft challenges. And as I said, for journalists, including the next generation of journalists here in this room, to learn from you and your work. Each speaker is going to talk for about 5 minutes and say a little bit about whatever they want to talk about, really. In the course, what was involved in creating this remarkable work. I'll then frame a few questions, get the conversation going, and then we'll go to the room and have a chance for all of you to engage. It does strike me, just at the top, that this year's winners have a few things in common. The most obvious is that both involve sexual assault and gender violence at their core. But that's the least of it in some ways. Both of these stories involved inquiring into the nature of evil, either the individual evil of a psychopathic perpetrator or the banal institutional evil of an educational institution. Both go way back in time and follow the ripples of trauma up through the present day. Both stories involved enormous challenges in making horrific events tolerable for the viewer, reader, listener, and also compelling. Subjects people would often prefer not to think about. And both stories also take us under the hood of big belief systems. In the case of Brigham Young University, a courageous encounter with how religious faith shaped and distorted an institution's moral compass. And in the case of the Transom piece, how a society's belief system about crime and punishment was affected by this kind of an event and how we contend with it now. So big themes as well as specific journalism challenges. I'm going to ask, I think, the Salt Lake team to go first. I don't know which of you wants to take the first 5 minutes, or if you just, one of you wants to take 10, or however you want to go, but go with it.
Okay, I'm Erin Alberty. I'm from the Salt Lake Tribune. I figure I just would tell you a bit about the story. I don't know if everybody read them. There were several that we entered, and there was also, this was a pretty small amount of the reporting we did over the past year on this topic, so there's a lot to it. I had heard, first, I want to say in a court filing about this possibility that BYU was investigating honor code violations in conjunction with sex assault reports or suspicions, but it was kind of obliquely talked about there. Now, to understand what this is about, you kind of have to understand the honor code at BYU. BYU is pretty famous for its honor code. It's very strict compared to maybe what a lot of other schools have. It's not just about academic integrity or don't cheat on your tests or don't plagiarize anything. The honor code forbids students from drinking coffee and tea and alcohol, illicit drugs. It regulates when male and female students who aren't married to each other can be in each other's homes. Men and women who aren't married to each other aren't to go to each other's bedrooms. There are certain times of day where they aren't supposed to be at each other's homes. And importantly, to this realm of coverage, it bans premarital sex and all, well, in the honor code, it's called homosexual conduct, or behavior. So there's a lot to it. There are a lot of prongs of it. And so I had heard in kind of trying to gather string around this topic that people had worried that just the fear that somebody would be investigated for one of these conduct issues would prevent them from reporting sex crimes against them. But I was struggling to find people who had made such reports, and I wasn't sure if it was just an in-theory concern or if it was, if this was actually something that the school might do. Well, that all changed about a year ago when a student got up during a campus event for Sexual Assault Awareness Month and said, I was sexually assaulted and the school has investigated me and they're punishing me, and directly confronted the Title IX coordinator. Title IX is, I mean, I know I'm speaking at a college here, so I guess everyone probably knows what it is, but it's the office that handles sex assault complaints. And confronted the director of that office and said, you know, what do you want to say about this? And the Title IX coordinator got up and said, well, we're aware that the honor code has a chilling effect on reports, but she said that the school does not apologize for that. And so when that was talked about, suddenly many sources became available and much easier to identify. I looked on, various social media avenues. I had already joined some social media groups that were private and in hopes of learning more about this topic, so that helped. That was on a Thursday afternoon, and by Monday morning, I think I'd talked to about a dozen current and former students at BYU who said that they were sexually assaulted and had their different accounts about what had happened. Now, we're a local newspaper with local competitors on a local story. We were not, at this point, looking at this as like, oh, this is something we'll study for a year and then we'll write our perfectly tailored series. We were like, oh my God, I think KUTV is on this too. So we were moving kind of fast and trying to get the first story out. But in that first story, we focused on 4 cases where we had opportunities for some background reporting, where there was documentation of the school's actions in several of these cases. And we had all these other interviews with people that, especially where the school was concerned, they kind of started to corroborate each other. As far as what the action they experienced at that point. So that turned into examining several different parts of this. One, and I think the most prominent one to me initially, was just the basic public safety question. What does it mean for a community when people don't feel like they can make a crime report without being punished for some other thing? And then what exactly happened in these investigations, what factors were taken into consideration. And then I think probably the last kind of big topic that I looked at, I was actually surprised to have found as many sources as I did on this one, but how this plays out specifically for LGBT students at a school where any homosexual behavior is banned. So I guess that kind of gives you the outline of what we did and what we looked at. There were a number of really revelatory law enforcement questions that came up in this coverage too. It wasn't actually part of our entry, but we discovered that in one of these cases, a county sheriff's deputy had, who was acquainted with the suspect in the case, had given this woman's entire police report file to the Honor Code office. There was a recorded interview that police did with him where he talks about how he wanted the Honor Code office to deal with her. He was charged with witness retaliation, and then a few days later, the county attorney asked for the charge to be dismissed. We have a pending lawsuit over the internal affairs records that we are told will explain why, but we don't know why yet. We learned that BYU's campus police, which is a state-certified police department, used its access to law enforcement records database to get information from a student's sexual assault medical exam report and gave that information to the Honor Code office. We have a pending look at how those databases were being used by campus police and you know, what that means for, you know, victim and witness privacy and other, I mean, there's a lot of issues that come along with that. And this spun out into a look at other schools in Utah. So I don't even know how much time I just talked. I really hope that didn't go
Probably
way too
about
long.
right. A little long, but we'll
Okay,
let.
sorry. So
All
there you go.
important.
That's my 5 minutes or more.
All important. Rachel?
Yeah, Erin left me a good starting place. Our entry was specifically for BYU and the various issues there. One thing that we talked about that is still sort of an issue in Utah, you know, our reporting spurred a lot of change, and the university instituted a lot of changes sort of as a direct result of our reporting. Amnesty for people who come forward to report a sexual assault from the Honor Code is something that they plan to implement. They've separated the Title IX office from the Honor Code office, but there's still sort of a perception and attitude that goes beyond policy, that a lot of victims and advocates are still worried is going to be an issue. It's really easy to change policy. It's not easy to change attitudes, and that's something that you know, has dogged sex assault reporting for decades, you know, and it's 2017, you kind of get the idea, like, sex assault's bad. We get, you know, you get it. Why are we still writing about rape? But we saw in our reporting that there was still so many attitudes about sexual assault and consent and accountability that in Utah, these stories were really needed. And to have Brigham Young University acknowledge that these changes were needed and that that people had been done wrong by was really powerful in our community, which is dominated by the Mormon religion, which, you know, in its core says that sex assault is wrong and that the victims are not to be accountable for that. But in the culture, that is definitely not something that a lot of people think. I talked to people who were assaulted decades ago at BYU and have never told anyone. A couple people, I was the first person that they ever told that they had been sexually assaulted. And in some cases, it took them decades to realize that they had been sexually assaulted, because it's just something that people don't talk about in Utah. And there's so much, you know, at BYU, kind of it's institutionalized, the idea of what were you wearing, because there's a dress code. And if you're wearing a low V-neck, you know, maybe you wanted to be sexually assaulted. And that's something that people who are trained in Title IX and, you know, university employees, those are the kind of questions that they were asking students. And as we did this coverage, we did expand it beyond BYU. You know, we wanted to talk to as many people as possible. We wanted to talk to people who had positive experiences, because you know, that's part of journalism too, is getting both sides. And people did have positive experiences with the LDS Church and with their clergy. But we also found people at other colleges in Utah who had experiences where they reported and their reports were languished or were disregarded. And as part of our series, we didn't enter in this one. We just had so many. We literally had dozens of stories on sexual assault last year, and we had no idea it was going to be a series. And But another school, there was a student who was accused of assaulting 4 different women who all went to police and also went to the school and was never charged, was not even contacted in some of the reports. And the women, 3 of them were students, and 2 of those women dropped out of school because they felt that they couldn't be safe on campus. And he went on to the NFL, and they continued to feel shamed about what had happened to them. Another reporter, Alex Stuckey, got those police reports, contacted the women who were had been, there's an idea that sex assault is so shameful, and the imperative thing is privacy and dealing with it privately. But these women had wanted someone to talk to, had wanted someone to tell their story and have justice brought to them. And Alex did that, and after we ran those stories, the prosecutors reopened the cases against this young man, and an additional 13 people came forward to say that they had also been sexually assaulted by him. And he's been charged with in seven sexual assaults in Utah, and that trial is ongoing. And we didn't come to this with the idea that it was going to be a series, and we were not going by the seat of our pants. That sounds, we spent a lot of late hours in the office, not seeing our families, and arguing over things and making sure we had made all the right ethical calls. But it was very, we talk to a new person and find a new idea to explore, a new facet of this that we hadn't thought of. And, there's a lot of perception that these are sob stories. When is the Tribune going to get done telling these sob stories? But, all of these women and men that Erin talked to, their story has affected their life and affected the people around them, and there's a ripple effect to trauma, and it's in our communities. And I think that these stories and the effect that they had really helped to illustrate that. And it's great that there's an institution that recognizes this too.
No, thanks. Sam, Jay, which of you wants to go first?
Go on, Sam.
Okay, I'm a radio producer, so I wrote down what I want to say. Hope that's okay.
But did you time it out?
The story of what happened to my mother in September of 1994 was never something I shared frequently or easily. It was more something I would tell someone if we got close and I felt they needed to know in order to know me. I'd usually apologize a lot afterwards because it seemed as if I was letting people into a reality that really terrible things do happen, and to people you know. A reality that I was fortunate to avoid until this happened to my mom. I think I also avoided telling this story because no matter how much time went by and no matter how many times I had told it before, telling it again always felt like an out-of-body experience. Even though I knew it happened, even though I lived through the aftermath with my mother, I couldn't quite believe it. I couldn't accept what she had lived through, what she had survived. Here are a few things I learned. Telling the trauma. One of the challenges was deciding which details of my mother's attack and her recovery to keep in and which to leave out. For years, my mother has been living with 2 huge plastic bins filled with all sorts of things related to this event: police reports, court transcripts, newspaper clippings, and more. When I decided to do this piece, my mom passed those bins on to me. For my mom, every moment of the 5 hours she survived were important. I don't disagree. But as a journalist, I knew we would lose our audience by putting in every detail. We needed to give an accurate recounting of what happened that night, one that my mother would ultimately approve of, while not driving listeners away. Having Jay Allison as an editor co-producer was critical in navigating this terrain. I trusted his guidance in what was important to keep and what would be okay to cut. My own post-traumatic stress. Lots of people told me that doing this would be hard, and they were right. Hardest of all was hearing again the details of what happened to my mother that night, and then hearing them repeatedly as I transcribed interviews, assembled the script, cut tape, listened to mixes. I spent many days practically immobile on my couch as a result. Revisiting difficult topics isn't for everyone. When I interviewed my brother for this piece, he said he doesn't like to talk about what happened. I've come to respect that point of view. While reporting this, I had stomach aches and nightmares. I locked my doors more, and one day I was even sure I saw Reginald McFadden, the man who attacked my mother, walking down the street in the small town where I live. Still, I know myself well enough to know what I can tolerate, and that not telling this story would be harder for me than telling it. Trauma spreads and stains. I've learned a lot about trauma from doing this story. For example, that while trauma may morph in intensity and form, it never goes away. It was seeing how present the trauma is for my mother still 20 plus years later that made me finally pick up my microphone and go. And once I did, I saw how the trauma had spread and manifested in others. For example, my brother, who, while he doesn't like to talk about what happened, is obviously very affected by it. Or Charlotte McFadden, Reginald McFadden's sister, who told me about a recurring nightmare she has about her brother. Or Mark Singal, the former lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania. He sat on the pardons board that let McFadden out. He spent 3 hours talking with me. He cried several times. At the end of our time together, I asked him about talking with me. I think this is just a clip of the end of our conversation. It's number 2. I'm wondering, just like the last couple questions, just what it's like for you to talk about this again, and what it's like for you to talk to me about it.
It's hard. This was harder than I thought. Man, because it's there. It's in my psyche. But when we talk about it and we become sharply focused on the emotions of what I was feeling at the time, wow, it was like it happened yesterday. So it really is draining. So I hope we don't go through this again. No offense.
And my last point is that talking about it helps. Doing this story has changed things, at least for me. I mentioned earlier the 2 big plastic bins full of stuff my mother gave me when I started working on this story. They took up residence in my home office for nearly 3 years as I worked on this piece. Whenever I saw them, they would send a jolt through my system, a reminder of what happened and that there was a story to be told. When the piece was finally finished and out in the world, I closed up the plastic bins and I brought them down to the basement. And I noticed for the first time that they had gone quiet. For all the difficulty in revisiting this traumatic event, one outcome, at least for me, is that I think I've truly come to face what happened to my mom that night in a way that I hadn't before doing this story. And that despite how difficult it was, I feel less terrorized by what happened and quieter on the inside.
I'll just talk for a very short time. At Transom and Atlantic Public Media, our little outfit up in Woods Hole on Cape Cod, we end up doing a lot of stories about trauma. It's not a traumatic place, to look at it. But we produce also The Moth up there, The Moth Radio Hour, if you're familiar with that, and we produce This I Believe up there. And I'm working now with Frontline, the TV documentary series. And so many of these stories, from the Moth stories to Frontline, the central defining stories in people's lives are often about their hard stories. Your identity is kind of forged in that crucible, and examining it and seeing what's there is what is kind of the foundation of drama and identity. And so even though there's huge pain, I think everyone is trying to figure out what's the meaning. And then stories arise. Our job in these stories is to combine the narrative with the meaning and make sure that the telling of it is important. And I guess that's really doing journalism. It's a way to rediscover and defend our collective humanity, to look at these things and retell them and learn from them. Another thing I'd say about this story is a little different. That usually you pitch a story or you get a pitch for a story. And this one, Sam just came in and said, look, this happened, should we, and I don't know yet what I want to say, but should we work on it? And it became, in a way, kind of a pure exploration. There wasn't a map about where we were going. There wasn't something we were reporting on. She just wanted to see where the ripples of this event extended. And so it became a quest, which of course is a classic narrative structure. And you can hear in Sam's voice in this piece, like the way she talks to people, whether she's talking to a lifer in prison or Tom Ridge, the former governor of Pennsylvania and head of Homeland Security, the first iteration, or her own narration. She's always speaking in the same way, and it's like driven by pure curiosity and intention and just wanting to know, which in turn then makes you, the listener, want to know, so that the story expands. This became a big story. It wasn't just, well, yeah, so my third and final point is just like, in terms of techniques, one issue with stuff like this is like you're in some ways handling toxic material. And the DART Center has information on this, like really just sort of good advice, like stand up and walk away from that picture sometimes, you know. The interview that Sam and Jeremy did, finally I said, I think I should just take that away from you, and I'll cut that. And that was like a huge relief, because some of these things just bog you down and you can't kind of keep going with them. The voice of the perpetrator, McFadden, same kind of thing, like toxic material. So the safety of the journalist encountering this over and over and over again has to be considered. One outcome at the end of this story was, are we going to meet the perpetrator? And finally, we felt it wasn't germane to the story, but also that we feared for Sam's safety in terms of physical safety and mental safety and head tripping and whatever kind of things might have occurred had that happened. Our structure was, intimate and large, the policy versus the family, and always making sure that every detail had served a purpose. And I think that's important, because if you dig down too far into the trauma alone, first of all, the audience can't bear it any longer, and then also it loses its context. Bobby Van Cura, the lead detective on this case, is here, by the way, and we have an amazing interview with him, and there was a 89-day manhunt, and we could and considered should we make this a serialized podcast, a multi-part thing, but we finally determined, like, what is the boundary? What should this be? And should it be a single experience, or should we follow all the rich veins of journalism and story? And we decided to bound it. So Bobby isn't even in the piece, which is too bad, because he's great to listen to. And then just finally, I think one trick we found for how to get people to listen, how to keep it from being too hard, how to keep them going, like, no, I can't. I don't want to hear that, I mean, it's a story about your mom's rape and kidnapping and beating. So this is what Sam would talk to the audience and just say, look, usually I just say, my mom's a victim of a violent crime. And that's what happens in trauma. You just put it in a box. And he said, but I have to tell you some details, and it's like, it doesn't give me pleasure to. This is hard for me. It's going to be hard for you. I appreciate. And by sort of bringing the audience into the effort, I think we kind of help them be able, and we'd almost give them like a timer, like, this, not too much longer now. We're almost done. So yeah, I know this is hard. It's hard for us. It's hard for you, and we'll get through it. That's it.
Okay, thank you. That, in case you didn't notice, you have just attended a 5-minute masterclass in telling difficult stories. Thank you for that, Jay. There are a few students who are here among the diverse folks who are from an ethics class that I teach. So I'm going to start out on that terrain and pick up on something Rachel said. You said that you were arguing late at night about ethics. For each of you as teams, what were one or two of the key, the most challenging, daunting ethical questions you faced, and you don't necessarily need to resolve them satisfactorily, but tell us about what you identified and how you found your way through it.
One of our challenges was with the story about the LGBT students, because two of the subjects in that story had attempted suicide and survived, and several of the others had contemplated it, and it was very relevant in their journeys. They had each explained very clearly in our interviews how the pieces fit together to kind of end up in that place. While I was working on that story, there was suddenly a big amount of buzz on social media, especially in Utah, about suicides or attempted suicides by LGBT Mormon youth. And I wasn't really sure it was essential to the story. So first just saying, okay, how much do we need to go there before we're introducing or at least exacerbating a contagion risk, when it was like in different mediums, this is coming up a lot. We had a lot of things to work on, so I actually kind of put the brakes on that story for a little bit, just to give some daylight, some breathing room in that issue, in hopes that maybe we could go a couple weeks without this kind of issue buzzing up again and see where it led to. But kind of deciding how to approach the story, knowing that this throughout the year had been brought up kind of again and again, and we'd had other stories about it. Normally, if we're going to be dealing with suicide in a story, we would have like an info box that gives like the hotline numbers and all the pertinent stuff. And in this case, we decided to make that info box the first sentence of the story. Because while each of those students that talked about that being part of their journey, it did get there. We didn't want it to seem like it was this inevitable outcome to being Mormon and gay and young. But it did happen. But the thing was, the two that attempted survived, and we're very glad that they had at this point. I mean, each person described, a recovery. So I called each of the students back in that story just to talk a bit more about what their recovery was, talk about our plan to put that up top, and would they be okay for us to say that there was a process of recovery, so we could start with that we weren't going to start with with the suicide thing, I guess, without kind of creating that buffer and that extra bit of safety at the top of the story. I don't know if that was the best way to handle it, measuring word for word how many, how do you talk about it? And that's, I think I spent a lot of time on your tip sheets on this one, because I was just like, I just did not want to make the situation worse. Like, I would rather almost not do the story than make the situation worse, So it was just that we spent some time on that, figuring out how to most intelligently and sensitively and carefully bring that into it.
And these are day in, day out choices. Every time you're picking up the phone, you're making an ethical call. What were one or two that you guys faced in what was probably a huge minefield of ethical messes? But
I don't think we thought about ethics. No. No, actually, I'm sitting here trying to think where we had to confront that, partly because it was personal and we weren't taking responsibility for other people's lives. There was maybe a different role, and so anything that would redound would probably fall on Sam.
what about kind of narrative ethics? What you thought about using or not using?
I think we spent a long time, one, thinking about how much of the story of what actually happened to my mom, how much to put that in. And then there was always this question of how much of McFadden's story to put in. And that was hard for me, because I had personal feelings about that. I am both curious about his personal story and want to know it, and at the same time feel like so much is about him. Why does this get to be about him too?
And maybe take us down a little further into maybe one instance of maybe something that stayed in or something that you cut out. Just one thing that shows the decision-making you had to go through. Or Jay, anything come to mind for you?
Well, we had a lot of information on him, on his childhood, on his previous crimes, and so we finally really left a lot of that out because there's sort of a prurient interest in the perpetrator, and they become kind of the star of their own show. And I think we left what was, because finally he was a symbolic character in a way, in that he catalyzed political change because he was a nightmare figure particularly to white suburban America. And he was the, released con who became a serial killer immediately and preyed on innocent victims, and therefore could catalyze political change that may have been lying latent, waiting for that boogeyman to make that change possible. And a lot of those changes have been terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, it was also a fight to not typecast, right? I mean, I didn't want to typecast.
Yeah.
Also.
Yeah. Well, and that I think gets to another thing, which is an interviewing question for both of you. Both of your pieces involve extraordinary levels of trust, involving people who have a lot to lose by telling their story, or, I mean, in your case, in the case of Salt Lake, there are so many characters who agreed to have their names used. That struck me. I mean, sometimes you'll find one or two survivors who are willing to have, but your pieces there are lots of folks who do, some folks who don't, but people, you had to get an extraordinary degree of trust there. I mean, in your case, Sam, your mother is your mother, but you also are talking to Tom Rich. You're talking to McFadden's sister, who has no reason to trust you particularly. As a craft matter, what steps did you take to win the trust and confidence of people on these difficult stories?
I was pretty surprised at how open a lot of these sources were immediately. And I remember one of the first, when we were doing our first stories, one of the conversations we had is like, wow, are we seeing the tides turn? Are people feeling like this is a safe experience to own publicly? Like the fact that we were talking to, mostly much younger victims that we're talking is like, well, is this where we're going? Because that would be kind of, a good thing, that this isn't automatically treated as something to be ashamed of or whatever. But I think, I mean, just talking, listening, letting them talk it out first, and just see where they went with it. And I think, well, for me, I mean, I don't know if it's like it's not a strategy, I guess I think about, though I guess I wrote it in my questionnaire, just taking it slow, so that, I don't, I guess, mishandle a detail, don't mishandle a sensitive moment. I think it was helpful, I think, to recognize when in an interview things were getting, I know the word is very fraught now, but it's as good a word as any, triggering. And them knowing that I could see that,
And how did you let them know?
I think, I didn't always know, but then it started to become a little bit more clear to me, just, asking, well, for example, in one interview, I asked a question, because this was the assault she was alleging was by somebody she didn't know. And I was trying to get a physical description of the guy to take to police to see what was the story here. And I asked for the eye color, and she just blanched, I mean, very visibly. And then the whole rest of the interview for a while, she was kind of starting to touch her face a lot and sigh a little bit between sentences and slump in the chair. And I said, you know, do you want to take a break? Do you want to stop this? Are you doing okay? And got kind of non-committal, yeah. And I said, can I ask, are you feeling physically ill? And like not in a know-it-all way, but just like genuinely curious. And then her face just crumpled and she started to cry. And I was like, okay, like I can see that. But I think being able to say like, are you feeling sick? Just, she knew that I knew, and it was understood that like, you know, I was going to build that into my understanding of her answers. And so we could take a break, and it didn't have to be this like no, let's power through an interview with a person who's so sick they can barely sit up straight in their chair. You know what I mean? So I guess that's one example. I don't know.
Yeah. Rachel, any of?
Yeah, you know, you mentioned that we used a lot of people's real names, and we did have that conversation. Like, this is, you know, when you're covering sex assault, it's really rare to get someone to tell you their story without it just being, you know, I don't want my name, anything associated with this. But with these, I think a lot of people saw that for so long they felt like they were the only one, and they saw these other stories and realized this isn't just me, this is happening to other people. This is something that isn't something that I caused or something that is unique to me. And, you know, over the months, we battled with a lot of universities over privacy and over student records. And I talked to a campus safety expert who said that colleges, you know, they tell people privacy is, you know, your privacy is our ultimate concern. We'll never let these records out. We'll never, you know, this department will never tell that department about this. And often what that ends up happening is that, you know, people's attacks don't get reported to the right people. And privacy is not a protection. It's not guaranteed of a protection. I think people are starting to realize that this focus on privacy just sort of sometimes goes too far the other way and makes the victims feel extra shamed. You know, like we will don't worry, we'll never tell anyone about this, and you know, you shouldn't either, kind of feeling. And I think that as people saw other women using their names and coming forward with their stories and being, you know, there's always awful people in the comments, but for the most part, people were respectful and saw that these stories had an impact that let them sort of want to tell theirs too.
And I think there's probably also some kind of a generational shift, both among assault survivors and in journalism. We're finding people contending with the idea of using names, which for a while was something we would never do, in a different way. It's an interesting thing. I got to ask this because you bring it up. Trolling, probably all of you, did all of you get like negative comments? How'd you deal with it? I mean, Sam, this is a very personal story for you. I don't know if you got negative social media stuff or.
We didn't get, I think when it was on This American Life, there may have been more. I think what I noticed more, and I actually learned this today by looking at your website, I was like, oh, that's what was happening to me, was that.
I really haven't paid in. This is not a condition of getting a DART award, is saying nice stuff about us, okay?
We got a lot of comments from other people who had terrible things happen to them. Yeah. And I literally was so, at first I thought, okay, I need to respond to these, but I was literally so overwhelmed by them that I stopped. And I mean, you know, some guy found my email address somehow, and he told this whole story about how he'd started dating this woman and how they started listening to this piece together and how she had to get out of the car and was sick, and that she ended up telling him something had happened to her, and could she write to me? Yeah. And so it was more extremely overwhelmed with what it brought up for other people.
I realize, actually, I want to circle back to what I was had asked you in the first place, though, which was now about building trust, and especially with McFadden's sister, but
Yeah.
on some of the other characters, it's not an automatic yes.
I think I'm in a very different position than you guys were, because for me, when I started doing this piece, I had my list of names of people I knew I wanted to reach out to, because I felt like living with them in my head for 20 years. I'd been thinking about Tom Ridge, I'd been thinking about Mark Single, I'd been thinking about Charlotte McFadden. And so when I made those phone calls, this was a big event in those people's lives too. And so when I would call and say who I was and who my mom was, I think that completely broke something that might usually exist between a reporter and an interviewee.
Yeah, I would say on Sam's behalf, it was like, once they met Sam and she sat with them, it was like they couldn't dissemble or keep her at bay. But Charlotte McFadden, I mean, reaching Charlotte was near impossible. I mean, that was just dogged reporting. She went to Philadelphia and just stood in front of the house and waited till she saw someone who looked like her, and then came out, and then Charlotte said, no, I don't know.
With Charlotte, I started to cry. I mean, I was so overwhelmed by meeting her that I started to cry, and she finally said, I can see you're upset. And
First, she didn't admit who she was.
Yeah.
at first she didn't, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Trolling, guys, back to you on that. Did you?
Well, I mean, I know different people have different thoughts about like what of like online discourse is worth taking seriously, and that the comment sections of a news article ranks pretty low. I read through as much as I could. I mean, we ended up with thousands of comments on a lot of these stories, so it was pretty hard to keep up with everything. But I was kind of like, look, I know that the people who are involved in this are reading this. I know that rape victims in Utah are reading this. I know that they're all going to see what the community reaction is. I need to see what kind of blowback that they're personally feeling right now. So I read through, there were a lot of really supportive comments, and then there were a lot of, well, if she didn't want to get raped, she shouldn't have broke the honor code kind of comments. The honor code's there to keep you safe. This is what happens when you break it. And so that hurt. And I know that for a lot of students who talked to me, it was seeing their own relatives talk about this story on like Facebook or whatever that, and say stuff like that was just like, oh, like, I mean, I had a number of students call in tears because, they'd been assaulted while they were students at BYU. And even if the honor code break was like very not the kind of thing you'd probably get in really a ton of trouble for, but it still was, an honor code violation, like I let the guy into my room to look at the computer or something like that. And then just seeing people that they loved and trusted, that was their reaction, that was pretty rough on a lot of the people that were involved in these stories.
Were any of your personal accounts targeted for harassment or anything in the wake of the story?
I mean, I saw an entire blog post written speculating about the sexual history of one of these students, and one of the students ended up transferring schools after FERPAing, like making a request for her honor codes records and seeing a number of accusations lodged against her right after she had spoken to the media. So, I mean, I
think also we have a sports rivalry in Utah, and there was and BYU is on one side and the University of Utah is on the other, and we had a lot of really strange attacks about like they're University of Utah homers, and that's the only reason they're doing this story.
I have never had so many people accuse me of caring about football.
Let's move toward questions from you guys. Let me ask one more round while people line up at the mic who want to ask stuff. I want to ask you, though, before we hear from the floor, about self-care. These are both hard stories, and you did them for a long time. What are a few practical things you did to take care of yourselves? I mean, Sam, you brought that up. Yeah.
Therapy.
Therapy?
Yeah.
And in addition to therapy, anything else?
Oh, I think just having people around who remind you to take breaks and go for walks and pull your head out of it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there were crying days.
There was only one crying day.
Well,
I mean, Jay, what about you? You're not exempted from this. You're looking at this stuff for a long time.
yeah, not like Salmon or Mama, but I would say, and I got depressed after it was done. And like I had a job to do in it, and like I was supposed to be, reliable and lean onable, and it didn't affect me a bit in the moment. And after it was done, it was like something just kind of caved a bit for a period of time, and it was fine.
Yeah.
I don't know if I was successful in self-care, to be honest. I started taking classes at a Zen center. I mean, not just because of that, but I mean, there's just sort of an emotional buildup. I hadn't really appreciated it until, we'd worked on these stories for a while, and then I hadn't been working on it. And I'm actually now our outdoor recreation reporter. So that's a very different kind of beat.
Talk about
it's Utah.
therapeutic.
It's a
Yeah.
really good beat in Utah.
Yeah.
But
The swag must be like really good on that one.
well, getting to go skiing for work for a day is not bad therapy. But then after this story started getting a lot of attention in recent weeks again, a number of people have begun disclosing their sexual assaults to me again. And not even to do with BYU, but just friends or people that I know. And I'm so glad that they did, so I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, but I am able to feel that like cocktail of feelings kind of coming back, the frustration that it happened at all, the frustration that there was little for them that they felt they could do about it, the fear of making it worse in some way by responding in the wrong way. And I had forgotten about it for a while because it kind of got out of my bloodstream, and now it's kind of back in. It's recognizable.
Rachel? Yeah.
I didn't do anything for self-care. I guess, try to disconnect, but that's the struggle with telling hard stories is, do I really want to do this? Do I want to do this every night, all the time?
Yeah.
But if you don't, what's the other option? I'm gonna go write press releases for a blender company? No, I think sometimes seeing the reactions of people to these stories was sort of a little bit of a balm too, to see, this story made a difference,
Yeah, well, it's true. Questions from the room? And let me just say a couple of quick things. A, to all questioners, please keep them short and to the point. B, we are being videoed for posterity, so don't embarrass yourself or your grandmother or anybody else. Yes, that's it. Go.
Okay, my name is Chandrakant Pancholi from Overseas India Weekly, and I have a question about BYU stories. You know that another newspaper had done the same type of story on campus rape, and it was repudiated. So in light of that, can you just guide through one of the cases as to how it originated and what steps you take to verify it, and what were the actions and reactions of the university establishment?
Yeah, good question.
I think probably the one that has been the most prominent and the one that was spoken about at the meeting where all of these stories started to flood out. That student had made a police complaint. We had, seen that. This was the one that led to the witness retaliation thing involving the sheriff's deputy, and a number of other things. So the police had done an investigation already, and that case is pending. We reached out to the suspect, but to no avail there. I think did we get correspondence about the school? Yeah, we had some correspondence about the school's action. That was actually interesting. A lot of the students that I talked to that were disciplined had correspondence from the school about what their thing was and what was going to be done, what was the punishment.
Did you, let me ask this, did you encounter survivors who you had hoped to work with, but who wouldn't give you the kind of verification access you
Yeah.
needed? And
Yeah.
how'd you handle that?
Well, every person that we talked to, I mean, there's no way, we talked to so many people we couldn't put in the paper anyway.
Yeah.
So, we did what we could with it. A lot of students were pretty open to a lot of nosing around just on account of Rolling Stone.
Mm-hmm.
Just saying those two words suddenly, which I hate to keep piling on and.
Well, but it's an object lesson, and one of.
I didn't really
Yeah.
appreciate how personally that had wounded a lot of these people, I guess, that they felt that people would think that they were lying. So that's when, the computers open up and this, I've got this, this email, this text message.
So that's actually quite interesting, because one of the fears at the time that the Rolling Stone UVA scandal unfolded was that it would prevent people from trusting reporters coming forward. And in fact, it sounds like while we as journalists learned something from it, it also sounds as if student survivors learned something from it and came to you a little more prepared to document their cases. That's interesting.
Yeah, and willing to brainstorm, because you don't know what is back there,
Yeah.
when you start talking to somebody. But, and then, there were some where it was just, we can't move forward on this one. We just can't.
Yeah.
There's, a mess here. So I don't know, I hope that answers your.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. No, well, we need to keep it moving.
Hello. First off, I'll apologize if my voice is shaky. I left my winter coat at home. I was curious, with all your reporting, what you found the most common methods that Title IX investigators who have actual procedures to abide by, how they are able to bury or silence complainants, or say bury a case with the methods that they have at their disposal.
I don't know that we can say that anyone was doing that intentionally. There was situations where certainly reports fell through the cracks, even after being brought to Title IX. There was allegations made at Utah State University, the case of the multiple reports against one student, that if you went to the Title IX office, they would say, you should report to police and not to us, because if you report to us, we're gonna have to look into everything. It's going to be really painful for you, so go to police instead. And that also was the same school where there was, and actually since our stories came out, they've talked about having confidentially so tight in place that someone who is under Clary is a responsible employee who would be responsible for passing along allegations of sex assault, would not be able to talk about a repeat offender unless they got signed permission from every alleged victim, which sometimes isn't possible.
Right. Some policies prevent them from addressing previous sexual or assault claims and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And let me just one little follow-up on that, 'cause it's a great question. When things did fall through the cracks, as you said, if there are reporters looking into this issue on other campuses, into assaults falling through the Title IX cracks or whatever, what are the conditions? What are the circumstances in which that seem most likely to happen? Any clues?
I mean, the situation at BYU isn't, it's such a different animal
Yeah.
from a lot of what was going
Okay.
on at other schools. I guess you handled more of the other school.
Yeah, I mean, falling through the cracks, there's, you might go and report to someone at Title IX who might not write down everything. And so then when even that student goes to the Title IX coordinator and said, so during verification, we said, do you have your Title IX report? Because the student under FERPA is entitled to get that. The student himself would go to Title IX and say, can I have my report? They would say, oh, we never made one because we don't make one until it gets this far in the process. And so that kind of allows them to, the school as well, to say, we only had so many sex assaults last year, and
So that's a good example of the kind of thing to look for. Okay, great. Thanks. Stephen?
Hi, I'm Steve Teach. I'm a forensic psychiatrist here in New York. I've started my work with Vietnam veterans, actually Vietnam, soldiers who were in Vietnam, and then worked in a prison with people accused of multiple and serious crimes for a while. I got a lot of things, but what I want to focus on is what you were talking about with your emotional reactions and what you did about them, as well as whether or not you used any mental health people as consults, both for yourself in what you were going through in the process and for how you might approach the people you were talking to.
And I mean, Sam, you talked a little about yourself seeking therapy, right? But did you get any advice about that contributed to the leap? Other than self-care, did you go to people for advice saying, what about understanding these things? Or
If I can just give like one example, I heard you were talking about I think Erin, you were talking about the woman you were talking to, the sister who became, I don't think it was sister, who became very tearful. At some point you went and said, do you want to stop? When you talked about what his eye color was, that's really a trigger into where her deepest emotions are. And what I might have followed it with is saying, what does that bring back to your mind of what you experienced at the time, and go into it rather than get back from it, because what you did is what PTSD does, which is cover up. And that doesn't allow it to get to what you described as the underlying stream that's undercover, where the emotions really are.
let's talk about this. To what extent was mental health in the background of the reporting piece of it?
Mental health information.
Yeah.
I mean, some of our sources were, mental health experts who were able to kind of give us perspective on how people handle trauma and what their responses might be like, and also gave us advice. I talked to someone for a separate story, and she said, make sure Erin's okay, because I know Erin has been talking to a lot of a lot of victims.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's tricky though, because we're not mental health experts, and we listen to these stories, but we're not therapists, and we can't let the women that we're talking to think that we are, because that would be damaging to them. We have a purpose, and it's different from what a mental health expert would bring to the conversation with them.
Why?
Let's.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want me to say
Well, if you had, or if you guys want to add anything.
I mean, I think going to other experts, especially law enforcement personnel that focused on sex assault, just to kind of get, I talked to them over the years and covering public safety, but just kind of how these interviews might go, that they tend to be not linear, that there may be a lot of jumping around, and the things that would be like remembered or not remembered, and that was helpful in doing interviews. I think that didn't put people on the defensive, but I think that, this is what I wrote my thing, when it came to like having somebody like really visibly like reconnect with their trauma, I wish that I had known more about what to do, and I still wish that I knew more. It doesn't come up as much in the outdoor recreation beat, but it does, but not as much. Because one of the things I was worried about just like leaving the interview, because it's like, well, I didn't want them. I wanted to give them the out if they wanted to, but I was a little worried about just being like, okay, so what? I'm just gonna like walk away and leave this person in Provo with this terrifying question of how long am I gonna have to be punished by the color of my rapist's eyes? Like that doesn't seem like a good end, like that. So I think in that case specifically, I felt unequal to the to the task, to be honest.
Jay, Sam, how did you think?
Not for Not for this piece. We've done other, I did a piece with Kelly McEvers, who's a host at All Things Considered. It was about her being a war correspondent and trying to figure out whether she should stop. She had a daughter. And she basically interviewed, John Lee Anderson or Christiane Amanpour or Sebastian Junger, saying, asking them, should I stop? But she also interviewed her psychiatrist, and she would sort of record those conversations. So everything was very transparent in terms of the effects of PTSD, whether, not the risk of the reporting, but also like what was happening
And
to
that,
her.
by the way, that piece is on the Dart Center website. It's a great one.
The only thing I would add, I think in the situation of my story, what was different is that we all shared a traumatic event. I mean, obviously, my mom's experience was very different than anyone else's in the piece. But that provided some common ground from where we started.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Hello. My question is about control over a story as a journalist, because you're always kind of taught not to give over too much control, and yet in trauma journalism, often victims have felt like their story has been taken away. So what you did differently during this process than you might have during other, and whether those conversations you had up front.
I mean, again, I feel like I'm in a different position because I lived with the story for 20 years before, and I knew my mom's, I thought I knew, and I think I did, her relationship to it. I was worried about her feeling like it wasn't told in the way that made sense to her, that felt correct to her.
But what was your, I mean, this is a weird thing to ask, but what was your contract with your mom? The way we have implied contracts with sources. Did she have veto power? Did she, what if anything, or did you just kind of figure you'd work it out?
I think we figured we'd work it out. She did hear a nearly final draft, and had thoughts about it. But I don't think we had a contract, did we? I mean, we had, we sort of had agreements as we went along about stopping if it wasn't going okay and those kinds of things, but.
Yeah.
I think she would have heard a lot more from me if she was able to go meet my perpetrator. She did talk a lot at first, and that was my great fear, that she wanted to go interview him. And I think then
That you would have complained,
You
you
would've
would have
stepped-
not
you
been
would've-
happy
you
if I
would've
had done that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I might have given her a lot of trouble.
Okay, good to know. What about you guys? Did you do anything differently than you would usually do in terms of permissions or rules of the road, or?
I think that we had a lot more conversations with the people in our stories than you normally would. It wasn't like dealing with a normal source, because the stories really were their stories from beginning to end. And there was, a little bit of that, not handing over control, but handing over some aspects of that, like our photography, our wonderful photographer is here, Leah. And, we let them decide how much of their face they wanted to show, and how much of their name they wanted to use. And that was important because we didn't want to, we didn't want to do the stories in spite of these women. We wanted to do them with these women and tell the truth.
Excellent. So we perfectly have two people at the mic and time for two more questions. Keep them focused.
So this is kind of piggybacking off of that question, but it's kind of involving informed consent. And I guess for, these stories, but also in other stories that you guys have done, how do you ensure that your sources, especially, in very sensitive kind of situations, understand the risks and or scope of kind of the project that you're working on? Something that I kind of internally struggle with a lot.
Usually the first thing I do when I sit down with somebody to make them feel comfortable and to sort of orient both of us to why we're sitting there is to remind them, I may have said it on the phone, but to say, as a reminder, here's what I'm doing. And to give them, in that moment, as much as I can, the scope of the project, which by them then saying, yeah, you know, okay, or asking questions or whatever, I feel like is their consent to be part of that. That was particularly hard with the politicians in this story, I would say. They really wanted to know what my MO was before we started.
They always do. But you know, you did do that even with your mom in the clip that we heard.
Yeah.
You did kind of lay out again, right, to Jeremy what you were doing.
Mhm.
So it held there. Yeah. Any other?
I think I went back to the sources a number of times because, you know, when I started this, I was just trying to find people that had this experience, and we were trying to find them very quickly. In many cases, our first interview was done really having no idea what sort of story they would end up in. So a lot of kind of returning back and making sure that they understood at the time, like right before publication, kind of how their accounts would be used. And I think, you know, we had some students who had real particular needs for confidentiality. With them, I did go over a number of the details I was using just so that because you don't know, like they know, what would be exposing and to whom. Mm-hmm. So that just was, you know, especially where they were still in a community very close to the alleged assailant, or where they were still, you know, exposed to possible honor code discipline, became kind of important. So, and then, I mean, there were tricky moments with that, I'm not gonna lie.
Another thing I just add really quick is
Yeah.
We usually often would publish online before we would go to print, and give the sources a chance to, you know, like the story's up, check it out, make sure, you know, we didn't mess anything up.
Well, that's interesting. So you use the flexibility of online publishing as a kind of you actually used it as a place where you could exercise a little
Yeah.
control, a little, yeah.
And that wasn't always the intent. Usually it was like, if we don't, you know, we need to publish this before it's, you know, 5 o'clock at night. We want to have people see it, not publish on a Saturday. But in one case, there was a woman who had not wanted to be interviewed, and we used only her police report until she went and she saw the story online and saw that there were 3 other women who had reported the same man, and then she called back and said, I want to do the interview now.
Yeah. Okay, closing question of the evening.
All right. Hello. Thank you all so much for your work. My question is, when you get to the end of a big project like this, a very heavy, long-term project, how do you then move on both professionally and emotionally in terms of how soon do you start other pieces? Do you do other pieces simultaneously? Do you change genres, et cetera?
Yeah, well, and I mean, and you know, clearly Erin has significantly changed genre. But Sam, what about you? I mean, this is the big one for you. I mean,
Yeah.
personal thing.
It was a relief to finish, and it felt like my brain was like reaching for this project for a long time. Like, where was this thing I had spent so much time thinking about and working on, and then there's it going out in the world, and in the case of this piece, it was posted on Transom, but then it got picked up by This American Life, so it sort of has felt like there's been several births of it. But I do feel done with it, and I have started working on another piece, and that's hugely helpful.
What can you tell us what it's on? Or?
It sort of was born out of this one, and it's a piece that I'm working on with Jay for the Frontline podcast, and it's about the Supreme Court ruling which says that it's unconstitutional to sentence juveniles to life in prison. And so Reginald McFadden was a juvenile lifer. His sentence was commuted. I, in this piece, came to the conclusion that I do believe in second chances, and so this piece is following the story of one juvenile lifer in Pennsylvania and his process of being resentenced.
Okay. Jay, you mentioned that it was kind of, you felt depressed when this was over.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, make too much of it,
No,
but
but-
it was,
but-
that's partly because of the weight of the material. It's partially also anytime you finish something that you've been invested in heavily. I have the advantage or disadvantage of weekly deadline. I mean, I have to turn out the Moth Radio Hour every week. We have Transom. I have a public radio station we run. and lots of other projects. So yeah, I can't stop.
Yeah. Do you have any
so
kind of?
that's
do you-
maybe good.
Do you have any little rituals you do when you're done with a big piece?
No, I
or
probably
anything?
should, because now I think I should. I don't know. Is that on your website?
I don't know. I just made it up, so
yeah, write that one up, because I need it.
This story has been for us like the Hydra. Like every time we think it's like we do one story and then that leads to 7 more. And even though I'm on the outdoor recreation beat this weekend, I was on a camping trip in the desert with my husband interviewing a complainant in a rape case for a story that my editor has just sent me a text message about, like while I was waiting for this to start. So we're not really done, and I mean Rachel can speak more to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're involved in 3 different lawsuits right now over records, police records, and student records. And, you know, having winning prizes this spring has sort of brought some of these specific stories and this topic back up again. You know, it's still an issue. We're not even close to done with it, and that's, you know, when we wrote that first story last spring, we didn't think like, oh, here's a beginning of a nice series, and we're going to sew it up at the end of the year and submit it for contests.
Yeah.
We're still working on it.
Okay. Thank you. So let's thank again our panelists, both for their insight and their work. Erin Alberty and Rachel Piper, Samantha Broun and Jay Allison. Can talk for a few minutes, but that's it for the DART Awards for 2017. Thank you all.